The rancher spotted the first loose horse just after sunrise, standing near the far fence line with its mane stirred by the cool morning breeze. At first he thought it was one of his own that had slipped through a broken rail during the night, but the color was wrong. This one was a deep chestnut, heavier built, with a saddle still strapped tight around its belly. That alone made him pause. No rider in sight. No trail of hoofprints leading toward the property gate. Nothing to explain how a saddled horse had wandered onto his land without a person anywhere nearby. He nudged his old gelding forward and approached slowly. The chestnut flicked its ears but didn't move. It looked tired, as if it had been running long before it reached his pasture. The rancher reached out a hand, letting the animal catch his scent before he touched the reins. The leather was worn and dusty, but not old enough to have been out for long. Someone had ridden this horse recently. Someone had come close enough to his ranch to lose track of it without leaving so much as a sign. He glanced across the field and spotted movement near a cluster of mesquite trees. 2 more horses stood there side by side. One was a gray with a tangled forelock, the other a tall bay that seemed restless, pawing at the dirt. Both carried halters but no saddles. Both looked as out of place as the first. 3 loose horses showing up on the same morning was not something he could brush off as coincidence. Still holding the chestnut's reins, he guided it toward the other 2. The trio watched each other with an odd sense of familiarity, as if they had traveled together, but had no idea where they were now. The rancher scanned the horizon again, half expecting to spot a rider limping toward him or waving for help. But there was nothing. The land stretched wide and empty, silent except for the soft snorts of the horses and the rustle of the early wind. He dismounted and let his gelding graze nearby. The 3 new horses shifted uneasily as he walked around them, checking for brands, marks, or anything that might tell him where they came from. Each carried a faint smell of smoke, not strong but noticeable enough to stir a quiet worry in him. Brush fires were not common this season. The ground had been damp from last week's rains. There was no reason for animals to smell like burned air unless they had come from someplace that wasn't safe. He crouched near the bay and spotted something faint in the dirt, a shallow indentation next to the horse's hoof. Not a hoofprint, much smaller, far smaller. He leaned closer and brushed the dirt aside with his fingertips. It was a footprint. A tiny one. The shape unmistakable. A child's. The rancher stared at it as the morning air seemed to tighten around him. The print was fresh. No more than a few hours old. Whoever made it had been right here, close to these horses. But there were no other marks, no dragging lines, no adult boots. Nothing except the horse tracks and that single small impression. His chest tightened. A child alone out here would have little protection, especially if something had happened to the adult who once held the reins of that chestnut. He rose slowly, his eyes sweeping the open land again. The horses snorted softly, their ears turning as if hearing something he couldn't. He followed the tracks a few steps, hoping for another print, a trail, anything, but the dirt ahead was too hard-packed. The rising sun made long shadows stretch across the ground, narrowing his view. He turned back to the horses, feeling unease settling deeper in his mind. He needed answers. Loose horses didn't wander with a child unless something had gone terribly wrong. And the scent of smoke told him there had been danger, maybe still was. He checked the saddlebags on the chestnut, hoping for a note, a map, even a canteen with initials carved into the leather. One bag held a small blanket. The other held nothing but a few strands of hay and dust, no clues, no direction. Just emptiness where information should have been. The rancher stood still for a long moment, letting the early light spread across the range while his thoughts spun. He needed to take the horses somewhere safe, but he also needed to search. If a child had been with them, that child could be hiding, lost, hurt, or running from something the rancher didn't yet understand. He looked at the horizon again. Something about the silence felt wrong, as if the land were holding its breath. Even the birds hadn't fully begun their morning calls. It felt like a pause before something shifted. He decided to lead the horses toward the barn to secure them first. Leaving them loose would put them at risk of wandering again, and he couldn't search properly while managing 3 unknown animals. As he guided them back across his pasture, the chestnut kept turning its head, checking behind them as if expecting someone to appear. The gray did the same, its ears forward, alert. Only the bay kept pace without hesitation, though its tail swished with impatience. The rancher opened the barn gate and led each horse inside. The place was quiet except for the soft clatter of hooves on wood and the rustle of hay. He tied them to separate posts and checked them once more, though nothing new came to light. No wounds, no signs of struggle. Just tension in their muscles and a wariness that suggested they'd been through something unsettling. He stepped outside to fetch water, but paused at the sound of a faint rustling near the side of the barn. His hand instinctively touched the handle of the tool at his belt. The sound stopped. He waited, breath low, listening. After a moment, a small bird fluttered out from behind a trough, landing on a fence post. He exhaled but didn't relax fully. Something still felt off. As he filled buckets for the horses, his mind kept returning to the tiny footprint. It had been clear, crisp, made by a foot small enough to belong to a child no older than 5 or 6. Too young to be out alone. Too young to be wandering with horses in unfamiliar country. Too young for any of this to make sense. He finished tending the animals and leaned against the barn door, looking across the pastures toward the distant hills. If danger had driven the horses here, that danger could still be near. He needed to ride out and look for signs. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't dealing with a simple case of a rider thrown from his mount. 3 horses. A single child's footprint, the smell of smoke. And nothing else. He went to his house and grabbed his map, spreading it on the table. The nearest ranch sat several miles east. Another lay to the north. He knew most ranchers around these parts by reputation, and none had mentioned missing horses. Besides, he doubted all 3 animals came from the same place. Their halters were different. The saddle on the chestnut was too finely made to belong to a small ranch. The gray's halter was patched and worn. The bay's was freshly oiled. 3 animals from 3 different hands, traveling together. His pulse kicked a little harder. They hadn't escaped from one ranch. They had been gathered, driven, brought together for a reason. And whatever that reason was, the child connected them. He folded the map and looked out the window. There were too many questions and not enough clear answers. The horses had come from somewhere troubled. Somewhere someone didn't want to talk about. Somewhere a child had been left behind or hidden or taken. He grabbed his hat, stepped outside, and mounted his gelding once again. He rode toward the place where he had found the footprint, hoping daylight would reveal something he missed before. The ground was still marked by the horse's tracks, but the small footprint seemed even more out of place in the bright light. He circled the area, scanning for any sign that the child had moved further, a broken twig, a brush of fabric. A slip in the dirt, nothing. But just as he turned to search another section of the pasture, his gelding pricked its ears and lifted its head high. The rancher froze. A faint sound drifted from the north, not wind. Not an animal. Soft, distant, frightened. The rancher tightened his grip on the reins, his heart pounding as he urged his horse forward. He didn't know who he would find or what waited ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. Someone out there needed help. And the dark secret hinted at by that tiny footprint was only beginning to reveal itself. The rancher nudged his gelding into a cautious trot, keeping his ears open for that distant voice. It came faintly again, drifting across the open land like a small cry swallowed by the wind. He couldn't yet make out words, only the tone thin and uncertain. He slowed his horse near a patch of low brush, listening hard. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the ground and making the shadows sharper. The cry came once more, now a little clearer, and he turned toward it, urging his gelding forward. As he rode, his thoughts kept circling back to the 3 loose horses and that tiny footprint. The sound he heard could be a trick of the wind, or an animal, or even his own worry playing with his mind, but he knew what he had heard. A voice, a young one. And nothing about the scene he had found earlier made sense without that missing child. The land ahead sloped gently toward a thick stand of cottonwoods. They grew around a shallow dip in the ground where water sometimes pooled after storms. Today the place looked still and dry, but the shade offered a place where someone might hide or rest. The rancher slowed again and scanned the trees. No movement, no broken branches, no clothing snagged on bark. He rode a slow circle around the grove, keeping quiet. He was about to dismount when he spotted something half buried under a clump of weeds near the tree line. A small object with a frayed edge. He slid from the saddle and walked over, pushing the weeds aside. It was a tiny boot, turned on its side, dusty but clearly dropped not long ago. The leather wasn't cracked. The stitching was neat, maybe handmade. There was no sign of damage, no sign it had been pulled off in a struggle. Whoever wore it must have lost it while running or stumbling. He held the small boot in his hand, feeling the weight of it. It was so light, small enough to fit in his palm. A cold feeling settled in his stomach as he slipped it into his saddlebag. He straightened and looked deeper into the trees. If the child was close, they might not cry out again. Fear could silence them, or exhaustion. But someone so young couldn't have gone far alone. He led his gelding between the cottonwoods, letting the quiet settle around them. The air smelled faintly of moisture trapped beneath the leaves. The shadows shifted as branches swayed. The rancher paused often, straining to hear anything out of place. His eyes scanned the ground for small footprints, but the hard-packed dirt under the trees made it tough to find clear impressions. A crow called overhead, sharp and sudden. The rancher tensed, scanning the treetops. A moment later, the crow lifted from a low branch and flapped away toward the hills, its black wings cutting across the sunlight. The rancher watched it go, uneasy. Animals often reacted to things unseen by humans. Something had startled the bird. He continued deeper into the grove, and there he finally found something more unsettling than the small boot. A set of tracks, faint but clear enough, lined the ground beneath a large cottonwood. Not boot tracks, not shoeless either. These prints belonged to a child, judging by the size and shape. The toes pressed lightly into the dirt, as if the child had walked carefully, trying not to make noise. But there was something else. The tracks were uneven, almost hesitant, and they stopped abruptly near the base of the tree. He crouched, examining the last print. It pointed toward a narrow path leading out the other side of the grove. The child had continued that way, but why stop so suddenly here? He glanced around and noticed scratches on the bark, too low to come from an adult. It looked like small hands had grabbed the tree for balance or shelter. But there was no sign of the child now. His heart picked up as he considered the possibilities. The child might have continued on foot, but the tracks after the last one were too faint to follow. Maybe the ground had dried out fast in the morning sun, erasing the impressions before he arrived. Or maybe someone else had been here and taken the child away. The rancher shook the thought off, unwilling to let his mind wander too far without proof. He returned to his gelding, mounted up, and followed the narrow path through the grove. On the far side, the land opened into a stretch of tall grass swaying gently. The path continued faintly through it, flattened in places as if something had moved through recently. He followed it at a cautious pace. The quiet grew heavier. Even the insects seemed less active. Something about the area felt disturbed, as if the land itself held its breath. The rancher kept one hand near the handle of the rope tied to his saddle, ready for anything. A few minutes later he spotted the remains of a small camp. Nothing more than a crumpled blanket near a fallen log, half buried under dry leaves. The blanket was tiny, patterned with faded colors that might once have been bright. Beside it lay a tin cup and a small satchel that had been torn open, its contents scattered across the ground. A wooden toy, carved and simple, lay near the satchel, a tiny horse with chipped paint. He picked it up gently, rubbing his thumb over the shape. The camp looked abandoned in a hurry. Leaves were disturbed, a corner of the blanket was twisted. The tin cup lay on its side as if kicked or dropped. But the worst part was the lack of any adult presence. No second blanket, no larger tracks. No signs a grown person had rested here overnight. The rancher stood slowly and examined the area. Whoever set up this camp had taken care to keep it small and hidden. It might have been a temporary resting spot, but the footprints leading away from the blanket were all small, child-sized. The rancher's chest tightened again. How long had this child been alone? And why? He looked toward the hills where a faint trail wound upward. The grass there had been pressed down recently. He squinted and saw marks that suggested movement, not hoofprints, something lighter. Perhaps the child had climbed toward the rocks. But why head into rough terrain? The rancher mounted his horse again and followed the faint trail. As he climbed higher, the view expanded across the valley, revealing the 3 horses still secured near his barn far in the distance. The sight reminded him that whatever danger those animals had escaped might still be lurking. He reached a rocky outcrop and dismounted, leading his horse by the reins. The ground here was uneven, dotted with scrub bush and loose stones. The path narrowed, winding between tall rocks that cast long shadows. The air felt cooler, the breeze stronger. He paused often, listening. Nothing but wind whistling through the stones. Then he noticed something caught on a thorny bush near the edge of the path, a piece of fabric, pale, worn, and torn. He pulled it free carefully. It felt like part of the same blanket he had found back at the camp. The tear looked recent. That meant the child had come through here not long before him. He moved forward with more urgency, though still cautious. The path curved around the rock face until it opened onto a small clearing. There he found more signs. A small piece of apple on the ground, bite marks scarring its surface. A few crushed berries. Someone had tried to gather food. The rancher felt the weight of worry settle deeper. A child wandering alone would only survive so long out here. He scanned the clearing, but there was no one in sight. Only the quiet rustle of dry grass and the soft thud of his horse shifting behind him. Then he heard it again, the faint sound of a voice. This time it was clearer, not a cry, more like a whisper. A soft, trembling sound. It came from the far side of the clearing, near a cluster of rocks stacked at odd angles as if nature had shaped them into a narrow hiding place. The rancher stepped toward the rocks, every sense alert. He didn't know what he would find or whether the child was hurt, but he knew he was close. The sound drifted again, a small breath carried on the wind. He reached the rocks and saw a shadow move inside the narrow gap between them. Something shifted, barely visible in the dim space. The rancher swallowed, his voice low and gentle as he spoke. He didn't know the child's name or what they had been through, but he knew this much. Someone was hiding behind those rocks. And whatever drove the 3 horses onto his land had driven this child here too. The dark secret behind those loose animals was no longer a distant question. It was right in front of him, waiting in the shadows, about to speak for the first time. He woke earlier than usual the next morning, long before the sun began to warm the plains. Something about the quiet felt different, like the land itself was waiting for him to make sense of the strange signs he had found near the creek. He kept replaying the tiny print in his mind. It had been so small, sharp at the edges, lighter than the weight of a child, yet carved into soil that would not take a mark unless real force pressed into it. Every time he thought about it, he felt a tightening in his chest. He had seen all kinds of tracks in his life. Deer, coyotes, cattle, even the odd stranger riding through the area. But that print did not match anything he knew. And the horses had behaved as if something had scared them badly. That part kept bothering him more than anything. He threw on his boots and stepped outside, letting the early cold settle against his skin. A soft wind carried a faint smell of dry grass and dust. The ranch spread out in both directions, wide and open with gentle slopes leading toward the ridges. It had always been his sense of home and balance. Yet now he felt as if something unseen wandered within that familiar space. He walked to the corral where the 3 loose horses were resting. They stood huddled together, still unsettled and watching him with wide, anxious eyes. He spoke softly while checking their legs and coats. No bite marks, no scratches, no broken fences. It made no sense. Animals didn't spook this way without a cause. He decided to ride out toward the creek again, hoping the rising light would show something he had missed. As he saddled his horse, he kept glancing toward the east slope. The memory of a shadow moving there came back to him, faint and fast. At first he had convinced himself it was a passing cloud or a trick of the fading light. Now he questioned that thought with growing doubt. He finished tying the gear, mounted up, and guided his horse toward the same trail as the evening before. The ground felt different in early light. The dew softened the earth under every step. Birds called from distant branches, though their usual lively chatter seemed reduced, as if even they sensed something uneasy in the air. When he reached the creek, he dismounted and crouched where he had found the footprint. The soil had dried more, but the shape was still there. He crouched lower, studying the size and angle, trying to picture the posture of whoever or whatever had made it. It appeared human in shape, but the size threw off every guess. Too small for an adult, too narrow for a child, and placed with a kind of balance that didn't match any human gait. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the rise of concern. He scanned the area again, eyes moving from trees to brush to open patches of dirt, searching for tracks or signs. He found nothing clear. Still, something felt off. Broken twigs, unusual drag marks near the water, and a faint indentation on a fallen log suggested movement, though not enough to understand. He followed those faint marks upstream for a while, staying alert. The wind shifted at one point, carrying a smell that didn't belong. It wasn't strong. It reminded him of damp wood mixed with something metallic. He paused, trying to place it, but the scent faded too fast. When he returned to the ranch, he found his neighbor waiting near the gate. The man leaned against his wagon, looking concerned. He asked if anything strange had happened the night before. His cattle had acted skittish and had clustered far from their usual grazing spot. That alone wouldn't be unusual, but he also mentioned hearing a distant noise, something he couldn't describe well. Not a howl and not a whistle, but some sound that slid between both. He said it moved fast across the hills and then disappeared. The rancher felt his pulse rise. He asked if the neighbor had seen anyone riding through or camping nearby, but the man shook his head. The hills had been empty for days. They talked a little longer, comparing details. The neighbor left uneasy, saying he would stay alert in case the odd sound returned. The rancher spent the rest of the morning checking fences and scanning the outer boundaries. He wanted to calm the horses, but they stayed restless, pacing the corral or lifting their heads at every distant sound. Normally, they settled fast after any trouble. Their continued agitation told him something was still wrong. He felt eyes on him at times, not from the house or the barn, but from somewhere farther out. Each time he looked, he saw nothing. By afternoon, he saddled up again and rode toward the north ridge. It was the one place he hadn't checked yet, and something about its steep rise and thick brush made it a good hiding spot for anyone passing through. As he climbed the slope, he noticed more signs: a bent branch, a patch of dirt brushed clean, a faint mark on a stone that looked like it had been scraped intentionally. It reminded him of someone marking their way. But again, no clear tracks followed. At the top of the ridge, he paused to take in the view. The land stretched out with a quiet sweep, the ranch house tiny in the distance. He scanned the valley and the tree lines. Nothing moved, yet he couldn't shake the sense of a presence nearby. He walked his horse along the ridge until he found a small alcove of rock, shaped by years of wind. Something caught his eye there. A small piece of cloth caught between two stones. He pulled it free and studied it. The material was thin and rough, not from any clothing he recognized. It carried a smell he didn't like, the same faint metallic scent he had noticed earlier. He folded it and placed it in his saddlebag, planning to look more closely later. As he turned to leave the alcove, he saw another print in the ground near the base of the rock. Similar in size to the one by the creek, similar shape. He crouched again, feeling a cold tightness in his chest as he realized that this print was fresher. Whoever or whatever it belonged to had been here recently. Maybe even earlier that morning. The light faded early behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the slope. He didn't want to linger. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as he mounted his horse. The animal shifted uneasily and snorted as if sensing something below. He didn't wait to investigate. He turned toward home, riding at a steady pace, keeping one hand near his rope and the other on the reins. The sky grew darker as he descended the ridge, and the feeling of being watched grew with each passing minute. When he reached the valley floor, the wind picked up. It carried a soft whistle that made him tighten his grip on the reins. The horse jerked its head, ears turning sharply. He urged it forward until the ranch lights came into view. For the first time in years, he felt relieved to see the warm glow from the windows. He rode straight to the barn and shut the door once inside, not wanting the wind to follow him in. He took the cloth from his saddlebag and studied it again under the lantern light. It looked handmade, but with precision, not something stitched carelessly. The edges were worn, yet the fabric itself felt sturdy. He set it on his workbench, running his hand over the surface as if the material might reveal some clue. Then he placed it next to the rough sketch he had drawn of the strange print earlier that morning. Seeing them side by side created a deeper sense of connection between the footprints and the unknown traveler. He didn't know what to make of it yet, but the mystery grew more concerning. The rancher couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the last day were only the beginning. The escaped horses, the tiny footprint, the strange noise that traveled across the hills, the cloth hidden in the rocks. Each small sign pointed toward something more complex than a simple wanderer passing through. He wondered if anyone else in the region had seen or heard anything unusual. It might be worth riding to the town later, asking quiet questions without spreading alarm, but part of him hesitated. He wanted more evidence first, something solid he could show. He stepped outside for fresh air, standing still as the night deepened. The moon rose slowly, casting a pale glow across the ranch. The stillness felt heavier than before. He could hear the wind brushing through the trees, yet beneath it he sensed something else, faint and distant. A sound so soft he almost missed it, a gentle tapping rhythm coming from beyond the barn. His chest tightened again. He moved slowly toward the sound, careful with each step. When he reached the corner of the barn, the sound stopped. He waited, listening hard. Nothing happened. The silence returned, heavy and complete. He backed away and returned to the house, locking the door behind him. He did not usually worry about locks. Out here, the land was open and calm. But tonight, he needed that small barrier between himself and the unknown. He checked the windows once more before sitting at the table. The lamp flickered slightly, and he leaned forward, trying to make sense of everything. His instincts told him the strange visitor meant no ordinary trouble. Something or someone was tracking a path across his land with an intention he could not yet read. The horses had sensed it. His neighbor had sensed it. And now he felt it too, growing stronger by the hour. He knew he had to follow the signs before something worse happened, but he also knew he had to move carefully. Whatever had left the tiny footprint had crossed his land twice already, and the second time had been too fresh for comfort. He could only hope he would uncover answers before the visitor returned again, closer than before. The wind rose again the next morning, stronger than before, sweeping across the plains and rattling the windows as he stepped out onto the porch. He felt a tightness in his stomach that had nothing to do with the cold. The strange footprint, the cloth from the ridge, the tapping sound near the barn, the restless horses, all of it lingered in his mind. He kept running through the details, trying to connect them, but the pieces never quite fit. The land felt unsettled now, as if holding its breath. Even the air carried a sharpness he was not used to, like something unseen waited just beyond sight. He walked to the barn to check on the horses. They were grouped in one corner, pressed close with their ears pinned and eyes wide. They didn't calm even when he spoke to them, their sides lifting with fast breaths. He frowned and checked the stalls for snakes or stray animals, but found nothing. Instead, he saw a thin line of dirt near the back wall. It looked as if someone had dragged a stick or a narrow boot across the ground. He followed the line until it stopped just a few feet from the stall door. He crouched, examining the dirt with slow care, hoping for another clue. There was nothing clear, but the line itself felt intentional. He walked outside again, scanning the yard. The wind carried dust in swirling trails over the dry ground. For a long moment he stood completely still, listening. He didn't hear tapping this time, only the wind and distant rustle of brush, yet he felt watched in the same uneasy way as the night before. He tightened the strap on his coat and decided to ride out earlier than planned. Something was moving across the land, and he needed to find its trail again. He saddled up and turned toward the north ridge. The memory of the fresh footprint near the rock alcove lingered like a warning. As he rode, he kept his eyes fixed on the ground, searching for signs. The light grew stronger, revealing patterns in the dirt he had missed the day before. A faint line of steps far off to the west caught his attention. They were light and spaced strangely, almost as if whoever made them drifted rather than walked. He followed them slowly, careful not to lose the narrow path. The trail led toward a cluster of trees near an old dried pond. The area had once held water in wet seasons, but now only cracked earth remained at the bottom. He dismounted and walked around the edge, scanning for traces. He found one, a small indentation near a fallen branch. It matched the tiny footprint shape. He felt a chill rise up his back, but he kept looking. On the other side of the pond, partly hidden in the weeds, he saw something darker pressed into the soil. He walked closer. It was another piece of cloth, larger than the one he found earlier and torn along one side. He picked it up, noticing it carried the same metallic scent. His chest tightened with growing unease. He studied the ground and saw a scuff mark that showed something had moved toward the trees. He followed it quietly, leading his horse by the reins. Inside the tree line, the air felt heavy. The branches blocked most of the sunlight, leaving patches of shadow scattered across the ground. He walked slowly, listening for footsteps or breathing or anything that might indicate someone nearby. He didn't hear anything, but he did see something ahead, a shape among the roots of a large tree. He moved closer and realized it was a small leather pouch. It looked handmade like the claws, stitched with thin pieces of sinew. He hesitated before picking it up. Inside were tiny stones smoothed by water, a piece of bone carved into a thin sliver, and a handful of dried plant stems tied together. They looked arranged with purpose, not random at all. He placed everything back into the pouch and tucked it into his coat. Whoever left it behind had done so recently. That much he felt certain. The silence inside the trees weighed on him. Even the wind seemed to stop at the edge of the grove. He felt tension rise in the air, thick and pulsing. He checked behind him, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. He mounted his horse again and rode out fast, wanting distance from the strange quiet. When he reached open ground, he slowed the horse and looked back. The trees stood still, holding their secrets in the dark space beneath the branches. He headed home, planning to study the items later. But halfway down the trail, he spotted smoke rising from the direction of his neighbor's land. It was not heavy enough to signal a fire, more like a thin ribbon drifting upward. He urged his horse forward and reached the fence line within minutes. He called out but heard no answer. Only when he got closer did he see the neighbor standing near a small pile of charred brush. The man looked rattled and kept glancing toward the hills. The rancher asked what happened. The neighbor said something had come onto his property during the night. Not a person, not an animal he recognized? He never saw it directly, but he heard it moving, felt its presence, and found small marks in the dirt behind his barn. Marks like the ones the rancher had seen. The neighbor burned the brush after finding the prints, thinking maybe it would scare off whatever wandered near. But he admitted it didn't make him feel any safer. The rancher showed him the cloth and the small pouch he had found. The neighbor studied both carefully, shaking his head. He had never seen anything like it. They talked a while, comparing signs and details. Each new discovery made the feeling heavier in the air. Whatever had come through the area had moved across both properties. Both sets of animals had reacted. Both men had sensed the strange presence. And now there were more clues pointing to a pattern. The rancher returned home with a deeper sense of urgency. He placed the cloth and the pouch on the table next to his earlier sketch. When he looked at everything together, a story began to form, though he still didn't understand its meaning. He leaned forward, examining the carved bone piece. It had small marks along the edges, faint but intentional. They looked like symbols or a code. He tried to trace them with his finger. The bone felt oddly warm against his skin, as if carrying a faint energy. He set it down quickly and stepped back, rubbing his hands together. The house felt too quiet, the air too still. Each time he glanced at the table, the items looked like they held answers he wasn't ready to uncover. He needed space to think. He needed the open land to clear his mind. So he walked outside, letting the wind settle around him again. He walked toward the far end of the ranch where the fields stretched wide with tall grass. The movement of the blades in the wind always helped him steady himself. Today, though, something felt different. The grass shifted in uneven waves, not matching the wind patterns. Some patches moved faster, others slower. It almost looked like something passed through the tall growth just ahead, brushing the blades aside. He froze, watching close. The movement came again, a soft ripple cutting through the grass. Then it stopped. His pulse sharpened. He stepped forward, careful and slow. The grass ahead fell still. He walked another few steps, scanning the ground, searching for footprints or marks. He found one. A small indentation pressed into the earth between two clumps of grass. Another footprint, fresh, very fresh. He felt his stomach drop. He looked up again, eyes sweeping over the field. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. But the print told him someone or something had been right there moments before. He backed away, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on him again. He turned and walked quickly toward the barn, his mind racing. The tracks were getting closer to the house. Whatever he was dealing with was no longer staying at the ridges or the creek or the tree line. It had moved into the heart of his land. Nightfall came with a heavy sense of pressure. The air grew thick and humid, as if the land itself was bracing for something. He checked the barn doors twice, then secured the gate leading to the fields. The horses remained uneasy, shifting and snorting, picking up sounds he could not hear. He tried calming them with steady words, but they kept raising their heads toward the window, listening to something he could not sense. He lit the lamp inside the house and placed it near the window. The soft glow helped ease the shadows, but it did little to ease his mind. He sat at the table again, the items spread in front of him, the carved bone, the stones, the cloth, the sketch of the tiny footprint. The more he stared at them, the more he felt they belonged to something ancient, something not easily explained. The wind changed direction and carried a faint sound toward the house, a soft tapping rhythm, not on wood this time, not on the barn. It came from the edge of the yard, far enough to remain hidden but close enough to be heard. The rancher stood slowly, his breath tight. The tapping grew clearer, following a pattern like a message. He stepped toward the door, stopping only a few feet from it. His heart pounded hard as he listened. The tapping stopped suddenly, then another sound followed. A single step pressing into the dirt, light, precise, close, too close. He stood completely still, aware that the next moment would change everything. The presence he had felt moving across the land had finally come within reach, waiting right outside the boundary of his yard with an intention he still could not understand. The suspense tightened around him like a wire drawn too thin, holding him in place as the night pressed deeper. He stood in the doorway with every muscle pulled tight, listening to the faint crunch of dirt just outside the yard. The night pressed in around him, thick and heavy, and for a moment he wondered if the dark itself held the shape of whatever waited out there. The horses shifted restlessly in the barn, hooves scraping against the boards. Their unease pushed him to act. He reached for his coat, stepped outside, and closed the door carefully behind him. The tapping didn't start again, but he sensed the presence still close. He walked toward the edge of the yard where the moonlight fell over the dry grass. The wind had calmed, leaving the land strangely still. He paused, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. A few feet ahead, near a patch of tall grass, he saw a shape lower than a grown person, but too large to be an animal like a fox or stray dog. It stayed perfectly still. The rancher took a slow step forward, careful not to scare it. When he got closer, the shape moved slightly, then rose. It wasn't the threat he expected. In the soft glow of the moon, he saw a small figure standing unsteadily, wrapped in a loose blanket torn at the corners. The figure looked toward him but didn't run. Even from a distance he could see the trembling. He stepped forward again and lowered his voice, speaking calmly the same way he did to nervous horses. The figure didn't answer but held its ground. As he moved closer, he recognized the tiny shape of the footprint that had led him across the ridges and fields. The mystery that had consumed his days and nights now stood only a few feet away, shivering in the quiet dark. He kneeled slowly, leaving space so he wouldn't frighten whoever had been wandering the land alone. He spoke softly again, asking if they were hurt or lost. The small figure hesitated, then lifted a hand from beneath the blanket. In the hand was the same kind of carved bone he had found earlier. This one was shaped differently, longer and smoother. It glowed faintly under the moonlight, as if polished by many days of handling. The rancher recognized the careful markings along its edge. It matched the bone he had found in the pouch. Whoever this figure was, they had some connection to the objects scattered across his land. The rancher gently reached his hand out, waiting for permission. The figure stepped closer and placed the bone in his palm. The moment he touched it, he felt a warmth that wasn't from the night air. He didn't understand it, but he knew this bone meant safety to the figure. He tucked it into his coat pocket and motioned toward the house, offering shelter. After a long, cautious pause, the small figure nodded. He led them back to the house, guiding them inside where the lamp glowed steady on the table. The warmth of the room seemed to ease the tension in their shoulders. He poured warm water into a cup and offered it. The figure accepted with slow, careful movements. When the blanket shifted, he noticed small scratches and marks along their arms. Nothing dangerous, but clear signs of wandering through brush and rough terrain. He asked again how they came to be out there. This time, the figure gave a small response, a voice barely above a whisper. They said they had been with someone in the hills, someone they trusted, but had been separated when a storm rolled through. They tried to find their way back, but kept getting turned around. The cloth pieces, the small stones, the bone carvings were things they carried for comfort, tools and charms given to them by the person they traveled with. When the rancher found them scattered across the land, he thought they were signs of something dangerous. But they were simply things dropped along the way as the small figure struggled through the rough ground alone. He asked about the tapping sounds he had heard at night. The figure looked down and admitted they had tried to get close to the house before but became scared at the last moment. They didn't know if the rancher was kind or angry. They tapped on the barn hoping someone would come out, but when footsteps inside moved, they ran. The horses had sensed them and reacted with fear, but the figure had only wanted help. The rancher felt a mix of relief and guilt. All the tension he had built up over days had been tied to a frightened traveler trying to survive. He sat on the edge of the table, letting the realization settle in. He asked who they had been traveling with. The small figure said it was someone who collected herbs, stones, and carved bones into small charms. They taught them how to survive, how to follow the land, how to find water, but during the storm they had been separated. The person promised they would meet at a certain ridge if lost. The figure tried to reach that ridge but always ended up circling back. The rancher nodded slowly. He knew the area well. If they had been thrown off course by the storm, they might have passed the ridge without recognizing it. The rancher decided he would help find the missing person in the morning. Tonight, though, the traveler needed rest, food, and safety. He fixed a small meal and set it on the table. The figure ate slowly, watching the objects the rancher had collected earlier. When they saw the small pouch, their face changed suddenly, eyes filling with recognition. They rushed forward and opened it, checking the contents. Some stones were missing, the figure said. The stones were important, meant to keep them steady on their path. The storm must have scattered them, and the figure had been searching ever since. The rancher showed them the stones he found in the pouch earlier, gently returning each one to their hand. The relief in their face softened the tension in the room. When the figure finished eating, the rancher offered the spare cot in the corner. They settled onto it, exhaustion pulling them down quickly. He watched their breathing slow, their shoulders relax for the first time since he had seen them. The house grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not tense, not waiting, just calm. The rancher sat at the table, studying the carved bone pieces again. They represented not danger but guidance, made by someone who cared for the traveler resting in his home now. He checked the symbols and noticed they matched the faint patterns on the cloth he found earlier. Everything connected. The objects were part of a system used to help the figure navigate the land, not frighten anyone. When dawn came, he saddled his horse and gently woke the traveler. They ate a light meal and stepped outside. The morning was calm, the wind low, the sky soft with early colors. The horses no longer seemed frightened. They approached quietly, sniffing the traveler as if sensing the truth at last. The rancher lifted the traveler onto his horse, knowing the search ahead would take time. Together they rode toward the ridge the traveler described. The land felt different now, no longer heavy with unease. Instead, it felt as if the answers waited patiently for them to arrive. Hours later, as they circled the ridge, the traveler pointed toward a cluster of stones stacked neatly beside a fallen tree. The rancher hadn't seen them at first, but once he looked closer, he realized they matched the arrangement of one of the symbols carved into the bone, a signal, a marker. A message left behind. They followed the markers one by one until they reached a sheltered cove where someone sat wrapped in a cloak, leaning against a smooth rock. When the traveler rushed forward, calling out, the figure on the rock lifted their head. The reunion was small and quiet, but full of relief and warmth. The rancher stepped back, giving them space. The tension that had followed him through the fields and nights finally lifted. He rode back home later that day, feeling the land settle again. What had seemed like a dark secret had turned into a story of survival, signals, and the instinct to protect. The rancher looked across the fields, knowing he had followed every sign because something inside him refused to ignore a cry for help, even one hidden in clues scattered across the land. As he reached the barn, the horses greeted him with calm eyes and steady breaths. He checked the fields once more, not for danger, but with a sense of gratitude. The land had stories to tell, some unsettling and some hopeful, and he had been part of one that reminded him of the power of instinct, kindness, and paying attention to the smallest signs. In the end, the tiny footprint that once filled him with worry became the key to understanding a mystery that brought strangers together and reminded him that not every unknown carried danger. Sometimes it carried someone who simply needed a safe place to land and someone willing to listen.